Well, thanks a lot for this very generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for the hospitality. It's my third time here, so apparently I'm getting addicted to STM innovation seminars. What I will indeed try to do is to share with you the basic philosophy and line of thinking that we will try to develop in the report we are now finishing. It will not be public by the end of the year because we will then have to deliver it to the European Commission, and then the Commission will sit on it and make it a bit warmer perhaps, but it will certainly be published early next year. This is the background of our research center, which is basically the basis also for a lot of work that we include in the report. So it's a combination of the basic study of how science and technology develop and how they interact in innovation processes, but also evaluation research and the development of tools for the management and evaluation of research and researchers. Okay, open science. This is the definition that the Competitive Council of the European Union formulated in May 2016, and this is basically the starting point of what's called the open science policies of the European Union. And I assume that not everybody is as familiar with that as a lot of people in Brussels, so I will say a few things about this as a background, and that will also perhaps, I hope, explain the position that our report will take in this whole thing. So the basic idea is that open science will enable scientific research to have a larger impact on broader sections of society, that it will also help to professionalize and increase the quality of research by making it more reliable, more efficient and accurate. And the idea is also to make the scientific system more responsive to developing societal needs. So it's pretty comprehensive, and this means that open science is about much more than open access. I would like to stress this because I can imagine that as a publisher you're busy with open access on a daily basis, but perhaps you're not busy with all dimensions of open science. And these are the 8 topics or problem areas, you could say, that the European Commission has identified in its open science policy. So this is about how researchers are rewarded and incentivized, the problem of measuring quality and impact in research evaluations, of course, the future of scholarly publishing with a big debate about the role of commercial publishers, open data, the open science cloud, I'll say a few things about that. And to top it off, we're also dealing with research integrity, citizen science, and open education. Not a small list. Our report is a bit more limited, but let me first give you also a view of the scope. So this open science policy building, or yeah, maybe it's an organism. I'm always not completely sure about that, but let's say it's an organism. It is composed of different components. So one is the Open Science Policy Platform. This is basically a group of stakeholders that are giving advice, and that on the basis of their position in the development of scientific research indicate various directions and problem areas. This is a very important platform that gives advice into this open science policy process. Next to this, a couple of expert groups have been formed, and there is an expert group on rewards, there is an expert group on skills, and the expert group that I'm currently chairing is about indicators. So these are 3 expert groups that feed their reports into basically the open science policy platform. There are 2 important tools in development. The Open Science Monitor, which is supposed to capture trends in the development of open science, and the European Open Science Cloud, which is supposed to be the digital environment in which European researchers will work. So this is the overall framework. The Open Science Policy Platform recommendations are basically policy recommendations directed to the national level, but also in some way to the institutional levels. And these are some of the recommendations about indicators. So it's partly about don't do a couple of things with indicators because they will inhibit the development of open science. And there are a couple of recommendations of do these kind of things in order to stimulate open science. As you've noticed, I'm not reading the slides. I hope you don't mind doing a bit of multitasking in the early morning, but otherwise it would take away too much time. And I think it would be interesting to have a bit of a discussion about these things. The last bullet point on this slide, of course, is an important problem because quite important sets of metadata are now currently privately owned. And then saying that they should be open is a nice statement, but how to do that is an interesting challenge. I'll say a bit more about that somewhat later. The Open Science Monitor is in development. There were 2 reports about this. I'm not going to bother you with all the details about that, but basically there is a kind of prototype which is in a way based on pretty simple measurements and indicators, and the idea is to capture developments like the percentage of open access publications compared with all publications, the level of access to open data repositories, also the development of open science policies. Of course, that's not the same thing as measuring the practice of scientific researchers. The idea basically is that this will help policymakers both at the European and at the national level to see where we are in the development of open science. The Open Science Monitor, by the way, there is a bit of a debate about that. Some people think it will develop in a tool that then perhaps could be delivered on a routine basis by private companies. Other people think that the Open Science Monitor will in the end be replaced and displaced by the European Open Science Cloud. Because if you have this idea of a cloud with every digital object identified, with robust identifiers and machine-readable data and compatible data formats, then you could say that the measurement of the development of open science could be built into the cloud and could be a kind of a set of algorithms and routines that are running on the cloud, and that would then actually make the current form of the Open Science Monitor superfluous. But that's still not completely clear how this will develop. It's easier to claim that there will be an open science cloud than to make it, but maybe something that your organization and your companies can contribute to. The Rewards Working Group was an important working group because many researchers and research organizations have the feeling that the way researchers are currently evaluated is a barrier for the development of innovative open science practices. So hence these recommendations, basically a recommendation to reform fundamentally the way we evaluate both individual researchers, research groups and research institutions. And these recommendations are aimed both at research performing organizations and at funding organizations. And this Rewards Working Group has also published in its report, it's all available on the web of course, an interesting career evaluation matrix, which is basically a pretty detailed list of indicators and contexts in which they can be used with all sorts of ideas on how to apply them. I will come back to that also in the context of our report. Of course, the skills working group is important because there is the feeling that if you want to develop more advanced open science practices in many research fields, it will require additional skills. And it's not self-evident that researchers at the moment already have these skills. So hence these kind of recommendations: train researchers, provide support, make career development an option. For example, you could imagine that open science practices and infrastructures will also enable the development of new types of professions, information specialists, that are not exactly researchers, but may have to be trained in a research framework. And this is also seen as an important element of the open science framework. So you could say the European Commission has thought about everything. It's pretty comprehensive. In addition, the point, of course, is that I think the strength and the problem of Europe is that it's so diverse. This is also a strength, but it does require an interesting conversation about how can you translate generic European goals into specific national policies and routines and new initiatives. And this has been the topic of a mutual learning exercise, which was basically a group of people traveling around in different countries and having a debate at the policy level between experts and national policymakers. And these reports turned out to be actually quite interesting, more interesting than I expected, to be honest, in the beginning. This is a long list of what's called common ground, so what are basic ideas about open science that should be taken into consideration. But what I find especially interesting are the key principles that this mutual learning exercise report, the fourth report, the last one, which I think is the most interesting one, has identified. These are interesting principles because they will also enable, if they are taken into account, the development of open science practices in a variety of contexts, because it's actually not one thing. And that's a bit the problem with the term open science, and I'll say a bit about that, why we will in our report propose to see this. I mean, we can't propose to change the language because it's all in important documents. But of course, the problem of open science tends to give the impression that it's all about science, whereas the idea is that it's also about humanities and social science and arts research. So it's one thing. And then the idea is, so open science also gives the impression it's only about the system, the current scientific system, and it also gives the impression that there is something completely new, that comes on top of everything that's already happening. And actually it's a bit more complicated, because you could say that if you look at a bit further in the future, we can expect that all scientific research will be performed in a framework which we now see as open science. So basically it will become a normal part of everyday practices. And then it would not be necessary anymore to pay all sorts of addition to all sorts of new things that are now developing. The second point is that if you look at practices, they are quite diverse. You already saw this on the slide with the 8 points. I'll come back to that. Also that if you talk about practices, they're actually quite diverse. This also means that it will not be able to capture them in a simple set of metrics or indicators. The key principles of the mutual learning exercise reports are respect for diversity, collaboration. So diversity points to the big differences that exist between disciplines and between different scientific practices. And also about diversity in terms of mission of researchers. So some researchers try to solve a big problem, other researchers try to contribute to fundamental knowledge, and they have yet no clue whatsoever what it might mean for humanity at large. Diversity also points to the need to develop a more diverse scientific workforce. So this is already happening, of course, because science is becoming global, so this means that many different cultures are now contributing to scientific research, but this also needs to be included in the set of indicators and policies that we are developing. Collaboration is mentioned because many indicators that are used in the scientific system emphasize competition. And many careers are only made possible by emphasizing your competitive position. In a way, it's also natural that competition is an important point, but collaboration is equally important, and it's about the balance, of course. Accountability and transparency is about the societal role of scientific research and the social responsibility. And of course, fairness and impact are important issues if you want to develop this open science framework. Impact is partly about scientific impact. Okay, let me quickly move to our report. These are some of the lessons that I think are also perhaps interesting for you when you think about new possibilities for scholarly publishing. Partly because if you really want to do it, you of course have to become practical. Business cases need to be developed. Then we also have to deal with the debate in the scientific community about the role of publishers in the whole framework of the information cycle in research. So this is basically, this was the conclusion in one of the reports, that if we want to go to indicators and data sets and metrics for open science, we need to measure what matters and it must be used responsibly. So the fear here is that if you would impose indicators that are ill-suited, it might damage the process of scientific research. So that's a bit the fear, and this is the reason why responsible use of metrics is emphasized. Partly because there is a big debate in the scientific communities, independently of the open science policies, about whether or not the current evaluation and career systems are actually still fit for use. And there is a strong feeling that we need to reform that anyway. Okay, next generation metrics. So we have the assignment to develop, to basically make progress with respect to the problem of which indicators should be used or can be used to foster the engagement of researchers with open science. So this means we are proposing a set of indicators or evaluation policies. And this means that, first of all, we want to depart from the perspective of responsible metrics, as was published in one of the reports for the UK research frameworks. So these, I think you know this is old stuff. And we also take as a point of departure the Leiden Manifesto for research metrics, which is focused strongly on how indicators are being used in the evaluation of individual researchers, with some warnings, and please don't do this kind of recommendations. This was published in 2015 already, so that's also old stuff. This is a bit newer, and perhaps for you also a bit more problematic. So we, as a center, we have decided to support the initiative for open citations because we think that it is important for the scientific system that the infrastructure and that the data that are used for evaluation of researchers are openly accessible, so that all parties can also check the quality and validity of the evaluation process. And this is currently not the case, because the two important citation indexes are proprietarily owned, and the references to the scientific literature, notwithstanding the initiatives of Crossref, are still not completely openly accessible. And we think it would be, for the scientific system as a whole, an important step forward if this would be made openly accessible. It would still enable, I would like to say, for-profit companies to add value to these kind of processes by adding services, usable tools, interesting perspectives that are not easily extracted, not automatically extracted from the raw data, but we think that the basic data infrastructure should become an open framework. Our report is based on an earlier report chaired by James Wilsden, which laid the groundwork for our report, and these are the 3 key findings of that report. I was also one of the members, so it's a kind of continuity. So we concluded at the time that currently there are no perfect metrics for the development of open science. The idea that alt metrics is the solution is a mistaken conclusion. They are interesting, but they are actually addressing social media communication processes, and that's a different dimension in many cases compared to the traditional research metrics. The responsible use of metrics is a key issue, and we have seen many problems in the past, and our idea was that we should prevent the same kind of problems with open science indicators. And there is an interesting issue which relates to this open citations debate, that if you really want open science to be developing in a full way, then you also need the metrics that measure that process to be openly accessible. Partly because of our accountability reasons and partly because of quality control reasons. These are the selected recommendations in that earlier report, where we distinguish between fostering open science and with a couple of long-term and medium-term goals and concrete policy recommendations, and removing barriers. So again, it's this two-sided approach. On the one hand, take away barriers in the current system that are inhibiting the development of open science. On the other hand, try to promote researchers and organizations to participate in this open science endeavor. Okay. The last couple of slides, I would like to give you this promised sneak preview. The members of the group are on this slide, so I'm trying to chair this. It's a fantastic group with policy experts, education experts, metrics experts, and none of them have a stake in the outcome. So we're really taking the position of people who try to advise on the best evidence available. So we think that our task is to propose new indicators and evaluation frameworks to overcome barriers, to reform the current academic reward system, and also to enhance capabilities to facilitate open science practices. There is a strong pressure, as can be expected in any policy system, to come with quick solutions and quick technical fixes. Our report will be a disappointment for everybody who expects this, because actually we will strongly advise against the idea to simply replace the currently existing performance indicators by new ones and then, problem solved. We think that is not only a mistaken route, but it may actually create a lot of damage, both to the current scientific system and to what you would like to promote. A subtle point also is that indicators for fostering open science are not necessarily indicators of already existing open science things, activities or systems or infrastructures. And this has to do with the fact that there is a complex interaction between infrastructures and behaviors of researchers. Also, open science is, we will emphasize that open science is a quite diverse phenomenon. And that is often hidden in the policy document. So in many policy documents it's summarized. And we will try to unpack this a bit. So in that sense, we see the Open Science Monitor as really a very first take on what you could measure. Basically, it's a form of quick statistics at a very high level of aggregation that doesn't say a lot about the underlying processes that are happening. So we think that, first of all, in our report in the beginning, we will redefine what open science is about. We will point to the diversity of practices. So developing open source software for research is something very different from open access, making publications open access, and that's different again from involving citizens in your research projects. So these would require, if you want to promote these kind of things, you need to do different. You need to do different things, you need to have different measures, and you need to take different initiatives. Also important point, in many documents so far, there is a tendency to implicitly assume that promoting open science means messing with the behavior of researchers. I'm now saying a bit bluntly. So the idea here, if we just, get all these researchers to behave in a different way, the problem will be solved. And we think that's a form of implicit micromanagement thinking, which goes against the grain and actually against many intrinsic motivations of researchers to do their work. So we think that a more mixed approach, where you pay attention to infrastructures, to facilities, and to behavior, would be a better mix than just immediately focusing on behavior. And I think this, to be honest, this is also one of the problems in the debate about Plan S. But I won't say anything about Plan S. I'm sure you've already debated about that quite intensively. What I would like to point to is something that's often not mentioned, and that's the question, how will open science policies influence power relationships in the scientific system? If you look at the distribution of scientific production, at the extent to which researchers are engaged in high-cited practices, the resources they have, there is a very strong relationship with economic and political relationships in general. The most powerful nations are also the most powerful in the scientific system. So basically, the current scientific system is a reflection of existing inequalities in resources and power distribution of power positions. Open science, if we don't pay attention to this problem, the same will happen with open science. And this is the topic of an interesting network, the Open and Collaborative Science in Development Network, which focuses on the problem, how will open science policies, as they are developing in Europe and the United States and in China, how will they influence researchers in the global south? And the conclusion of a lot of research that's digging into these kinds of things in Brazil, in South Africa, in Africa in general, in parts of Asia, is that the current model that is often implicitly taken as the basic framework of open science will not make science, by definition, a more inclusive practice. Many scientists will continue to be excluded and underrepresented. New technologies may also have effects of excluding people and groups. The question of who is shaping the priorities in research is an interesting problem. How democratic are our research agendas actually, and how are they being influenced? This manifesto, we will point to the manifesto, we will not completely repeat everything because this network has a slightly different take, but we think it's important to pay attention to these problems if we want to develop open knowledge practices. And some of the principles are on the slide. So, for example, openness should be seen as situated openness. There is also always a context in which something is open. And also, so this whole way of thinking, also thinking about justice in the scientific system, about inclusive infrastructures, it basically critiques a bit the idea that open science is by definition a good thing. And this is a bit, this could be read from the European policy documents, that open science by definition, it's not a problem, it's a good thing. We all want it. And we will problematize this a little bit, because the devil is in the details. It's very important how policies are implemented in order to promote, for example, equitable collaboration, rather than collaboration as a form of colonizing from scientific strong countries to scientifically more weak countries. So in our report, we will propose to use the term open knowledge practices rather than open science, in order to emphasize that it's not only about creating knowledge, but it's also about circulating knowledge. So the work of scholarly publishing we see as an important element of the whole thing. And also we would like to emphasize that if you want to promote open knowledge practices in this set of diverse contexts, it's more important to focus on the quality of the processes than on what's now traditionally in evaluation the emphasis, the outputs. So we will actually, for this reason, also warn a bit against the tendency to start to count what can be counted. That's usually outputs. And it's much easier than understanding and measuring the quality of processes. And also, we will propose an approach that enables the interpretation and the analysis of the contexts in which these practices are developing, rather than think, for example, that a thing like citizen science can be measured in one particular way, because it really depends on the type of citizens, the context, the country, the cultural context, the economic circumstances, whether or not some indicators will be useful or not. And for this, we will not propose generically usable indicators, but we will propose a set of indicator frameworks or evaluation frameworks. And if you're into programming, you could see this a bit as object-oriented programming. So you have a framework, and in each framework, a number of indicators can be applied with, a set of conditions that need to be fulfilled. So, for example, the dimensions that need to be considered in evaluation should be specified. The goal of evaluation, the mission of the research, the level of assessment. It makes a big difference whether you measure something at a national level or whether you're measuring the activity of a research group. You need to take into account non-academic stakeholders in the process. That's quite important. Completely disregarded in many current evaluation systems in science. And you need to pay a lot of attention to the research environment. This is a term from the Research Excellence Framework in the UK. And research environment usually means the conditions and the infrastructures under which researchers have to do their work. This, in our view, is actually crucial. The development, basically, if you think about it, you could say open science is necessary for two reasons. One is that the development of scientific knowledge and the explosion of knowledge we have about the world, the social world, the material world, requires a step, a higher level of quality and professionalization in the process of research, and this can only be done when it's completely transparent and accountable and many interdisciplinary connections are made possible. And the second, you could say, it's necessary because we are living increasingly in a knowledge society. And scientific knowledge has become so important that we can't just leave it to the researchers anymore. It needs to be managed in a more inclusive way. So we'll, basically this slide repeats this again, you know, not output measurement, but process evaluation is what we will propose. And this will be in each framework put in a slightly different way. And it's basically about the evaluation and appreciation of processes of knowledge exchange. So we hope that this will also help a lot of research managers that are now struggling with the problem of how to measure societal impact of research. This is immensely difficult if you focus the evaluation on outputs. And I'm not going, we can talk for hours about this, but the processes that trigger, that generate impact are complex. They take more time than is often given in the framework of evaluation. So it's much better to focus on processes of knowledge exchange. So we hope that this way of thinking will also influence the people who are doing the traditional research evaluations. And this slide relates to the earlier development network slide that I showed you. If we want to really develop open knowledge practices that are inclusive and that will also enable researchers in the Global South and in disadvantaged communities in Europe and in other parts of the world, and disadvantaged or underrepresented groups in the scientific system, if we want to include them in open knowledge practices, then we need to focus on capabilities. We need to create capabilities for researchers to make it easy to engage in all sorts of open knowledge practices, so that it becomes a natural element of daily practices rather than an additional task that the same group of people has to do. And here, non-research actors can play a very important role, and I think this is actually at the core of the mission that scholarly publishing should be about. If you think about the transformation from publishing to information or network activities. Some examples are on the slide. I won't talk about that because I don't want to take too much time, but I would like to conclude with suggesting two different modes in which these indicator frameworks or evaluation frameworks can be used. So we will have a limited set of frameworks, so for example one about developing citizen science in all sorts of contexts, or one about the evaluation of individual researchers, in which we will point to European projects like Acumen. But we will also pay attention to the question, okay, if you have these kind of frameworks in place, for example as a web service or as a set of instructions for evaluators, how will they need to be used? And there are basically two modes. One is the accountability mode and the other is the learning mode. And we think that it would be helpful if we would be able to focus the learning model on the links with scientific practices. So in which researchers are supported in their engagement with open knowledge practices in this learning mode of evaluation frameworks. What you could call formative evaluation in evaluation science terms. So this is not about judging whether somebody has done a good job, but it's about looking forward and see how a group or a set of universities or a country can basically engage in innovative, new, open knowledge practices. This, of course, is fuzzier than many science policy institutes would like. So that's why we think that it may also be necessary to have accountability model. And we think it's actually also quite useful to build into open knowledge practices and the data and indicator frameworks an accountability module. But we think this should be applied not to researchers, but to policymakers. So we would like to invert the power game here and propose that policymakers at the European level, at the national level, and at the level of institutions, so for example deans, should be held accountable for how they are promoting or supporting or enabling open knowledge practices. It could also be used, for example, to see to what extent scholarly publishers are doing their task properly. So we think that accountability has a role, but in the context of research policies, we think that a learning model, although this should also be useful for scholarly publishers and deans, but the learning model should mainly be used to engage researchers with open knowledge practices, so that it doesn't become the next set of tasks that. So there is in many. I'm saying this because there are in many universities. So you could say. So let's take a step back. You know, basically, you would think that people at universities are the happiest people in the world. They have a fantastic job. They can teach beautiful young people. They can do research. They can read books while the boss pays their salary. But if you walk around in a university, you don't see many happy faces. Some lucky guys and girls who got a big grant, they are happy. But many university teachers feel that they can't do their work in the time allotted to it, that they have to do too much at the same time. And increasingly, they have to also fill in bureaucratic forms for quality standards, for student satisfaction, to show that they have done all, you know, they're jumping through all sorts of hoops and they're keeping an enormous amount of balls in the air. And a lot of them are quite stressed. I think we need to change that. If you want to create a sustainable society with an active knowledge system, we need to have happy knowledge workers. And this is possible if we unburden the researchers from all sorts of tasks, and if non-research stakeholders are playing a more active role in the research process. And this is basically the philosophy, the basic thinking behind the summary of the argument that we will try to make in the report. And I think it would be very interesting if we would be able to continue a conversation to see what this means for the different stakeholders and also what it means for you as scholarly publishers. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.